Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through Dao De Jing. And today we are on number 21. We'll try to do number 21. And if we can get to it, we'll do number 22. So as always, the format is that we'll start by reading the translations that we like, and then we will go ahead and discuss it. Right? So who wants to go first on number 21? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to read the translation. We'll start with Dave, followed by Judith. Dave.
Good evening, everyone. The character of great virtue follows alone from the way. As for the nature of the way, it's shapeless and formless. Formless, shapeless, inside there are images. Shapeless, formless, inside there are things. Hidden, obscure, inside there are essences. These essences are very real. It's inside them is the proof. From the present back to the past, its name has never gone away. It is by this that we comply with the Father of the multitude of things. How do I know that the Father of the multitude is so? By this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. All right. Next up is going to be Judith, David, Evanique, Mike, and Brian. Judith, go ahead.
Okay, this is Stephen Mitchell's translation.
Mm-hmm.
The master keeps her mind always at one with the Tao, and that is what gives her radiance. The Tao is ungraspable. How can her mind be at one with it? Because she doesn't cling to ideas. The Tao is dark and unfathomable. How can it make her radiant? Because she lets it. Since before time and space were, the Tao is. It is beyond is and not it. It is beyond is and is not. How do I know this is true? I look inside myself and see.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. Next up is David.
Yes, this is Herman Ould again. The greatest virtue is but a manifestation of the Tao. The Tao itself is intangible, invisible, ungraspable, yet pregnant of things, dark, unfathomable, yet holding seed. This seed is truth, and in this truth is faith. From immemorial time till now, its nameless name and nature have not changed. From it proceeds all manifested things. And how do I know that such is the origin of all manifested things? How else than through the Tao?
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Next up is Evanique.
Okay, so this is from the Divine Feminine. The spread of great virtue flows only from the Tao, yet the nature of the Tao has no shape and no form. Vague, elusive, yet within an image, dim, obscure, yet within is an essence, hidden, dark, yet within is spirit, a spirit so vital that she is her own proof. Through the ages, her nature remains. Hence, we see the origin of all things. How do we know the origin of all things? From this.
Thank you. Next up is Mike, followed by Brian. Mike.
This is the Wayne Dyer 21st verse. The greatest virtue is to follow the Tao and the Tao alone. The Tao is elusive and intangible. Although formless and intangible, it gives rise to form. Although vague and elusive, it gives rise to shapes. Although dark and obscure, it is the spirit, the essence, the life breath of all things. Throughout the ages, its name has been preserved in order to recall the beginning of all things. How do I know the ways of all things at the beginning? I look inside myself and see what is within me.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Brian.
By Yasuhiko Genku Kimura. The outer expression of great virtue follows the inner subtlety of the Tao. Yet the inner subtlety of the Tao is altogether elusive and ineffable. Elusive and ineffable, yet there arises some image within. Ineffable and elusive, yet there exists something within. Cavernous and dark, yet there is some essence within. This essence is entirely real. In it is cosmic integrity. Hitherto, the name of cosmic integrity has endured and remains the principle of cosmic creation and decreation. By what means do I know the principle of cosmic creation and decreation? By means of cosmic integrity itself.
Wonderful. Thank you. Charlie, would you like to read the translation that you put in the chat? Okay, next up is going to be Jason. Jason, oh, Amon, you were saying something.
Oh, I was just saying Charlie's on mute.
Ah, okay.
Sorry, I just noticed that. Yeah, this comes from the translation by Roger Ames and David Hall.
Mhm.
Those of
Charlie, your voice is breaking up. So let's go with Jason. Jason, go ahead.
there are seminal concentrations of Chi within it. These concentrations of Chi are authentic and have written them true credibility from the present moment back into antiquity. Praise for waymaking has never ceased, and it's through waymaking that we can act in accordance with the sure size of the many. How do I know that the sire of the many is so? By this.
Thank you, Charlie. Next up is Jason. Where is Jason? Jason, you're on mute.
Sorry. Okay, so I think this one is very similar to chapter 14, if you recall. And I will consider this one as Dao De Jing's metaphysic translation. So he tried to talk about what is Dao, how does Dao look like, I think. So I think when I read this one, I kind of read this one as same as Plato's Timaeus, right? Basically talk about how does the universe start, all kinds of mystery things. So that's the translation I'm making. I make my own translation by reading the original text. So basically talk about the appearance of De, which is the virtue. It's only follow Dao. So then there is only vagueness when Dao is treated as a substance.
Jason, would you like to share your screen?
Okay, let me share. Okay, yeah, that'll be easier. Oh, yeah. Can you see my screen with chapter 21? Or
Yes.
Does it say chapter 21?
Yes, it does.
Okay, I have so many screens open, so I'm not sure. Okay, so the appearance of Dao, the appearance of De only follows Dao. So we have the two things. One is Dao, which is on the highest position, and the manifestation of Dao is name, okay, or manifestation. But the way we can follow, we call De, and we discussed before, sometimes we call virtue, or in Indian probably called guna, I don't know. But basically that's something else, okay, a little bit lower level. The reason I explain this is going to show up later again and again. So one is Dao, one is De. So probably I'm not going to translate De. Okay, I just use this one. So the appearance of De only follows Dao. There is only vagueness when Dao is treated as a substance. There is image in the vagueness. There is substance in the vagueness. The essence of the substance is in the deep and the darkness. What we believe is in the essence and is reality. From the present back to antiquity, its manifestation never disappears. Through it, we can understand the beginning of all things. How do we know the beginning state of all things? From this reason. Okay, so I think here has, if we go to detail, that's all the metaphysic world, right? From Dao, from De, manifestation, which is mean, somebody, most of translators consider as name, okay? And the De, so we can see like a 3 level, right? Like a trinity, okay? Dao is the highest one, then you have the De, which you can follow, which is virtue, okay? And they have name, which is manifestation, right? So that's the 3 things. And then here I try to explain, okay, what's the substance, what's the essence, and what's the reality. So that's the way ancient Chinese try to make sense, okay, for what's going on in this world, what's going on in the so-called principle with capital P. And I read this one just in the same way when I read Plato's Timaeus, right? Basically, he's talking about something, you know, five elements, all different triangle, how to change it. Okay, but difference of Plato is that he put a lot mathematics on that. And then the Tao, you know, they put a different way of thinking. So that's the way I interpret this chapter, and I hope it makes sense to most of people. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Folks, now it's time for everybody's comments. So what did you get from chapter 21? What do you think? What did you learn? What are your observations? We'll start with Dave. Dave, what did you get? You're on mute.
Yeah, well, that's my whole life story. Some things for Jason, in this scholarly translation by Henricks, specifically the 8, 9, and 10 lines, or the last 3 before the conclusion. The standard text says from the past to the present. Mine says from the present back to the past, and I think Jason said back to antiquity, but said those 3 lines would have rhymed because past is ku, gonorrhea is chu, and father is fu. So that's why they rearranged the line that way. Just interesting, but yeah, this is a very interesting poem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So folks, what do you think of this poem? What did you learn? Maritza.
So for me, Shrikant, the last 2 lines were the ones that kind of I mulled over them most. In general, I feel like the sentiment in this poem was kind of similar to what several of the others were expressing, but the last 2 lines seemed curious to me, and you know, it changed a little bit throughout all the translations, but in the Spanish translation, that's my favorite, it says, how is it possible to know? And the last line says, by having confidence in my own feelings. And so that kind of gave me pause. It's a slight different take on some of the other translations, but it's just, it made me think, it made me view the entire poem differently from the thought that, again, these are, this one feels almost like a conversation one is having with oneself. And it's almost reminders to not, take on airs and to remain grounded. And so, I don't know, that's kind of the way I saw it, like showing the contrast of, it's again, they're telling you it's only through letting go that you can be filled up, or, remain empty and you'll find yourself full. And we did see that in previous poems. But I just was struck by this one seems slightly more personal. It's like the same sentiments, but instead of looking out, this one's asking you to look in.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Maritza, would you read the Spanish version? And let's see if I think
Margarita here today.
Margarita is here. So if Maritza, if you could read the Spanish version, and Margarita, if you could do us the honor of reading it in Indonesian. So Maritza, go ahead.
Okay, this one is called Expresiones del Tao. La virtud se expresa siguiendo al Tao. Tao es evasivo e intangible, pero expresa toda forma y sustancia. Tao es oscuro y sutil, pero expresa toda la naturaleza. La naturaleza no cambia, pero expresa toda sensación. Desde antes del conocimiento, el Tao ha expresado todas las cosas. ¿Cómo puedo saber? Confiando en mis sentidos.
Wonderful, thank you. Margarita, and then perhaps Kevin or Jason in Chinese. Margarita, go ahead. And Margarita, what language in Indonesian do you speak?
The national language is accumulated from many influences, including Dutch, Malay. We call it Bahasa Indonesia. So, chapter 21, kebajikan yang terbesar hanya sesuai dengan Tao. Tao sebagai benda bersifat samar-samar. Di dalam kesamaran itu, dengan sepintas lalu dapat dilihat adanya semua sifat. Di dalam kesamaran itu, dengan sepintas lalu dapat dilihat adanya suatu rupa. Di dalam keadaan tersembunyi dan di antara kegaiban di dalam terdapat intisari. Intisari itu amat murni dan di dalamnya berisi pokok kebenaran yang dapat dipercaya keasliannya. Sejak dulu hingga kini dan masa yang akan datang, namanya tidak bisa hilang. Untuk menyelidiki asal mula alam ini, bagaimana aku dapat mengetahui kondisi asal mula alam ini? Ialah berdasarkan penyelidikan dari sini.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Jason, could you read it in Chinese?
Yeah, I will. But can I ask Marissa a question?
Sure.
Can you how do Spanish translate the so-called the first line? Because I see you translated the Tao, okay, as Tao.
Yes. So it says virtue is what is used in the beginning, and then it seems to take interchangeably the Tao and the nature. So in this translator specifically uses nature very often to speak of the way.
Oh, okay, got you. Yeah. The reason I find out is the Spanish translation, not this one, but most of them is very close to the essence, okay, of the Tao Te on the moral sense. But word by word, I think it's very far away from the Chinese word. So very biased, I'm in Southern California. My observation in today's world, Mexican, okay, are more Taoism, okay, than American, than Asian, okay. So Asian is least Taoism in today's sense. But of course, that's just my personal observation. That's why I always pay attention on what Marissa's translation, because got the essence, but the words is very far away, but the essence is very close. Let me read chapter 21.
So Marisa, you've been promoted to Taoist master now.
No way, no way, no way. I reject that banner.
They don't have to learn. It's a natural Taoism, I think.
I'm safe. He was talking about Mexicans. I'm good. I'm Puerto Rican.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I think you meant Spanish.
Okay, let me read the Chinese version. 孔德之容，为道是从；道之为物，为恍为惚。呼吸恍兮，其中有象；恍兮呼吸，其中有物；杳兮明兮，其中有精；其精甚精，其中甚性。自古及今，其名不去，以阅众谱。吾何以知众谱之壮哉？以此。It's very a poem, right? If you can see, it's a rhyme, and the first, except the last line, they all 4 words, okay? And most of the words are rhyme. And because I'm reading in the modern Mandarin, if I read it in the ancient song, which I don't know much, okay, it will be most of them will rhyme very well. The reason I'm saying in the ancient song is the dialect I spoke which kept a lot of ancient song. So I got the advantage to know more about the ancient song. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Laura, so it's going to be Laura, Marco, and Margarita. Laura, what did you learn from this chapter?
Well, I have to say what I learned is something pretty tangible. I have a 24-year-old woman who works for me, and she's at that stage in life where, she's not very certain about what she wants to do and very afraid of her future and very nervous and very lost. And I find myself in the position of having to give her some advice. And ultimately, what I told her is exactly what this last line says, pretty much. And it's very powerful, and I still find it very powerful. And I look back at me at 24 and where I was, and I wish I had the ability to think about that when I was 24. And I think I look at this as a guidance for me today as well. So the Tao for me is spot on in everything, I am just loving this from poem to poem. That's all I can say. And really it's spot on all the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Marco. Marco, Phil, Margarita, and Judith. Marco.
Yeah, for me, I kind of like the, it's like you don't want to grasp, like if you're feeling an emotion like sadness, but you don't want to like try to feel happy. So it's sort of like you want to try to, I think like the middle ground should be an emotion as well. Like, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I guess that would be like presence, but yeah, so like that's what I got out of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marco. Phil, what about you? You're on mute. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank Jason for introducing De, because I did not know this. And I like that, because what it says to me is that there's the Tao, which is unknowable, but it manifests itself. It unfolds itself through the De, which is sort of like the in-between world of symbolic forms that still retains its multifaceted dimension that could continue to unfold. So this is where the migration of the spirit of the soul is. The mistake is once it gets hardened, it can no longer transform itself because it becomes a static thing. So the migration process itself keeps it a living thing, but
it still nonetheless is symbolic enough that you can grasp it in some other dimension other than pure intellect and deduction. So in some sense, this in a sense introduce a way to skirt around the exclusion of the middle, which is a very important process because it keeps alive the process of knowing, that it continues to unfold itself so that we do have something to live by. So we're not just ignorant, but on the other hand, it does not become, how should I say, a permanent ideology of some sort. So it's really this in-between world that allows the migration to continue to take place. So thank you, Jason, for introducing this, because I did not know it exists. The Trinity seems to be a very important factor in this, the Holy Spirit, so to speak. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And I liked your way of describing that the Tao unfolds along the dough.
It continues to unfold. That's right.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Margarita, Judith, and Charlie. Folks, if you would like to share your thoughts and your impressions of number 21, go ahead and type ! in chat. Margarita.
Hi. What I read from this chapter is what I take for myself, my personal take, is because the truth will, just like Phil say, unfold across the time. We may not perceive one-time truth, so we need to be open for it process along the way. But sometimes I'm being human, I want to capture, I want to understand, I want to reason, I want to name things because I feel like as if like I have a control of something. So knowing that when I try to control things, I may not get the full truth, maybe I can be frustrated. But learning from this chapter, perhaps I should be more patient, like perseverance for myself in terms of dealing with frustration because I cannot understand yet, or waiting until I finish this investigation about what is the way, what is the truth. Thanks.
Thank you, Margarita. Next up is Judith, followed by Charlie. Judith.
What I like about these poems or chapters is depending on when you read them, they can evoke, they're very pliable. They can just mean different things or different things come to mind. So as a context, right before I read this for them with all of us today, my chapter said that the Tao is ungraspable. How can her mind be at one with it? Because she doesn't cling to ideas, and it is beyond is and is not. And I had just finished watching the video for tomorrow's Comprehensivist Wednesdays, Shifting Perspectives and Representing the Truth. And so that's what came to mind when I read that, is that it's like not clinging to ideas, because each idea is one perspective. Each label that we give is only a piece of a truth. And so the Tao truth, it's always trying to say in here that it's something that we won't be able to pin down. It's not graspable. And you just have to let it be. So I really like that. That's what it made me think of.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Amon, Jason, and Charlie. Amon.
Thank you, Shrikant. Actually, Judith, you sparked me to have to chime in, because when you were talking about representing truth, I think very early on, back when I first joined around chapter 7, one of the first comments I made was about the different structure of epistemology that is at work within this system. And you asked what we got from this chapter. This chapter is an encapsulation of that epistemology, of learning how to go about knowing instead of trying to pin something down as known. It's giving an instruction manual of self-reflection and what to search for in order to have an understanding that then becomes ubiquitous to all other things. You can see the behavior of all in the microcosm. That's a lot of what this gets at. And it got me thinking of, this is sort of tangential, but the attempt at the grand unification theory of science that just keeps falling flat and falling flat, because we've gotten to this categorizing and specializing point where everything is slotted in its perfect little place, but we now can't make these things mix together, no matter how hard we try. And the world seems to have no problem with it. It's our understanding and the way we're trying to understand that seems to be most problematic.
Aman, can I ask you a question? You said that this is a description of how to go about knowing. What is it recommending? What approach is it recommending? How would you put it?
When it talks of, it says De follows the Dao. So it's saying the perceivable virtues, the essence, the light, the thisness of things follows the way. That can be known. It's vague. It's an emanation out of deep darkness, but that is something that can be perceived, and you can know it to be in connection with that most ancient, that most sort of primordial original machinations of the Tao. Excuse me, I think Carl Sagan's way of saying this was, we're all stardust. And so there is something to that in this, that everything you're seeing is just another interpretation, just another version, just another representation of this very ancient principle. And if you know where to look in those manifestations at their De, you will get a better knowing of the Tao. Not that it will be known, but in that instant, you will have a knowing of.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Aman. Really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Jason and Charlie. Jason.
Thank you, Aman. I think that you make a very good point about this one, teaching the how to know. And because when I read this one, I constantly use the example of Plato's Timaeus, because why we read Timaeus? Because they talk about a lot of universe, and then we already prove it's wrong. Okay, today we still read it. Why? Because we read this one, we know how Plato approached the unknown. Same as when we read this one, we don't believe there's something called vagueness and then they have image. I think that's not what we are learning. What we are learning is how Lao Tzu approach without the current and scientific hard evidence, how he approached something unknown. And that's the thing I think we can learn from reading this one. And another thing I'd like to talk about is about this poem, its rhyme. And then after I think Dave talked about, and I start to look at, and then I try to read it in my local language, because I start to think about, I read, and surprisingly, the first 15 words, okay, they all rhyme. Okay, if I read it in my language, okay, my dialect, they all rhyme. So they have a purpose. So suppose probably it's a song or whatever to as a point. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Charlie. Charlie, go ahead.
A little bit of history, okay. I started off with Hinduism very early on when I was 12, and it grabbed me, okay. When I was 10 years old, I made a promise to myself that I could see a difference between children and grown-ups, and I promised to myself that I would never lose the perspective of a child, and I believe I've kept true to that promise. And but the problem was that when I was 18, I saw this structure of Western civilization as being enthralled, as being enslaved to a very abstract intellectual way of seeing things. In Hinduism, they have an expression called neti, neti, neti. It means not this, not this, not this. And it's about ineffability. And it's about this way of wanting to put things into a structure, an analytical, abstract structure based on symbols and so on. And the point is that you got to be really careful with that, because it's extremely dangerous if you take it seriously. You reify and you say this is what reality is. That you're heading down the wrong path. And so, you know, in Christianity, there's also this thing about unless you become as little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And then a little bit later says, oh, hey, by the way, kingdom of heaven lies within. And so those have been kind of guiding sentiments for me. And also I've been a culture warrior, you know, because of this whole thing about being against nihilism and this mechanistic materialism. And so I've been kind of fighting against that, as well as just the whole general culture of racism and imperialism and greed. And anyway, I took a course from Taoism from Roger Ames in 2015, and 6 years ago. And so that was the first time I really got turned on to this, you know, to a deeper understanding of Taoism. And I realized that I had a lot of work to do. And basically the problem is when I'm with little kids, you know, around 5 to 7 years old, I can fit right in with them. They're like my tribe, okay? Because I don't have to do anything intellectual. Don't have to do any of that, okay? I can just do heart to heart, human being to human being. And they notice that hey, this guy's kind of strange, because he's not like most grown-ups. You know, most grown-ups are sitting there, you know, wagging their fingers at us and you know, trying to make us, you know, behave like proper little boys and girls. And he's just like one of us. In fact, when I was living in a condo, I've always had relationships with children wherever I've lived.
Charlie, let's do one thing. I'm going to have you do an entire meetup. You've been talking about really fascinating things. Let's do an entire meetup. I think like maybe on a comprehensivist Wednesdays, because I really want to know your entire kind of approach to comprehensivism. So let's do that. We are trying to focus on the number 21 here. So let's continue with that, and we will do an entire meetup.
I just finished, because I'll take a couple of seconds. Okay?
Please.
Yes. So basically what I hear 21 saying is that's that you should, if you're into Tao and then you develop that's what it is. It's about, you know, being or presencing, you know, as Heidegger put it, but it's being present, okay? And all the intellectual stuff out, you know, you don't have to do that. You know, that's one of the reasons why Taoism is basically for everybody. You don't need to be an intellectual to do Taoism. You know, it's little children can do it. They do it already, you know.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. Great observations. I'm going to read my favorite translation, which is by Ursula Le Guin, and then we will go to Laura and Phil. If anybody else wants to comment on number 21, you can go ahead and type an exclamation mark. She calls it the empty heart. The greatest power is the gift of following the way alone. How the way does things is hard to grasp, elusive. Elusive, yes, hard to grasp. Yet there are thoughts in it. Hard to grasp, yes, elusive. Yet there are things in it. Hard to make out, yes, and obscure. Yet there is spirit in it, veritable spirit. There is certainty in it. From long, long ago till now, it has kept its name. So it saw the beginning of everything. How do I know anything about the beginning? By this. Next up is going to be Phil, followed by Laura. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I see it as, once again, I want to thank Jason, the whatever that is. I mean, not the Tao, but it's a ship that allows you to maneuver around the twin pillars of dogma and nihilism. Because the doer does in a way represent the Tao, but it has signposts. So it is connected to the Tao. And he's actually talking about creativity and the arts. The art understands that the language is using is connecting to the signposts. That evolves, it transforms, is not a dogma, right? And what this does is allows you, on the one hand, to be connected to the world in some intangible sense, but you can make sense of it, but not trapped in a dogma that this is absolutely so. So it continues to evolve. And I think that we have, perhaps in the West, put too much emphasis in analysis that led to dogma, and the rebellion against that led to nihilism. And this allows you, the ship, to maneuver between these two pillars of danger, to sail through it and still be on your way. So that is important. But it does have, the world does have signposts. It's not as the world is like just so confusing so that you can't even maneuver at all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phil. Laura, you had more points about number 21?
Yeah, as I read, well, the Tao is always there, I feel. And as I read this, I feel that this is kind of like a rite of passage that we all have to go through in growing up and becoming in the world, so to speak. And I think as we go through this, these are sort of the pains we have to go through in our own personal space a lot. And I think we have to emerge from it. And I think, you know, the end of the poem is really about that. And after we go through it, then we are able to see within ourselves, and then we've reached the point where we can proceed. Okay, and that's how I read it. I think it's a very personal poem for all of us. We can all read it, and it can be very personal for each and every one of us in its own way.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Madeline, Maritza, and Shane Murray. Madeline.
Yes, thank you, Jason and Aman and Shrikant, for putting this together. I have to leave fairly soon, so I thought I would get my question in now. It's about virtue, what Aman was saying about virtue. I got the impression that he was talking about the, I'll call it the here-ness, HERENESS of the world, and that the Tao is embedded in that and is not a transcendental quality, the way that we think of things as being in Western philosophy. And so that the way to follow the Tao, the virtue, would be to be as present with our instantiation as possible.
Thank you, Madeline. Aman.
I wanted to get a chance to respond before Madeline left, and I just pulled out one of my old books. This is from Dr. Edward Slingerland. It's called Trying Not to Try, and it's what he has to say about De. He says, people who are in Wu Wei have De, typically translated as virtue, power, or charismatic power. De is radiance that others can detect, and it serves as an outward signal that one is in Wu Wei. De comes in handy in a variety of ways. For rulers and others involved in political life, De has a powerful, seemingly magical effect on those around them, allowing them to spread political order in an instantaneous fashion. They do not have to issue threats or offer rewards because people simply obey them. On a smaller scale, De allows a person to engage in one-on-one interaction in a perfectly efficacious way. If you have De, people like you, trust you, and are relaxed around you. Even wild animals leave you alone. The payoff provided by De is one of the reasons that Wu Wei is so desirable and why early Chinese thinkers spent so much time figuring out how to get it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aman. Next up is Maritza, followed by Shane Murray. Maritza.
I got a little derailed, Shrikant. What Amon is describing, it sounds like we have a word in Spanish called iman, and it's a similar translation. When we say somebody has an iman, we're saying this person has this inner something is like attracts people, but it's not for outside or physical. It has to do with where they're at. So I got a little sidetracked. I was like, oh, I wonder if iman has anything to do with sorry. But another thing I wanted to mention as I was listening, especially your reading of Ursula Le Guin's translation actually kind of just solidified in me the fact that I realized that just about every English translation that was read here and that I've read, it talks about virtue as being a thing unto itself. Like some of them say the grand virtues or the virtue, and yet none of the, and I'm not sure if somebody's read it in a different language, I would love to hear the comments, but in all of the versions I've read in Spanish, it doesn't come from outside. Like it tells you that it says virtue is expressed by, and so virtue is not allowed to reside outside. And I thought maybe that's an anomaly for my favorite translation, but then I went back and briefly looked again at some of the other translations. And so I find it fascinating, this concept of, so what we're trying to say is that we need to be, like we can find things in the way, the meaningful path is where we're trying to get. And I'm wondering if it is a cultural change in viewing whether or not that meaningful path must come to us from within versus from without, because ultimately I see this poem as telling us that it's something that is found from within. But I just was a little bit fascinated by the idea that in most of the English translations, virtue is put on the outside, even though it's being used to express the desire for us to be on the inside with ourselves.
Wonderful. Jason, you have a response.
Oh yeah, but no, I just want to ask I think the Sarah already answered. What I want to know what Iman, what Marissa say. I think that's very interesting. But I also thank the group because, be honest, I don't like this chapter that much when I read it because it's a little bit vague. But after the discussion, I start to figure out, I probably want to call this chapter the Trinity, the Taoist Trinity, because it kind of ties Tao and the virtue or De and the manifestation, which feel called something unfold, or we call it the name. These three things, as a Trinity is if you consider Tao, So I would entertain this idea, So probably that's a good way to think about it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Before we go on, I want to read one more translation. This is a translation by Stephen Addis and Stanley Lombardo. This is the one that Dan recommends, Dan who does Nietzsche meetups, who's also deeply steeped into Taoism. This is the one that he recommends. Great De appears flowing from Tao. Tao in action, only vague and intangible, intangible and vague. But within it are images, vague and intangible. Within are entities, shadowy and obscure. Within there is life, life so real that within it there is trust. From the beginning, its name is not lost, but reappears through multiple origins. How do I know these origins? Like this. Next up is Evanique.
Yeah, when something just came up for me when Maritza was talking about virtue as something that comes from within and that people are attracted not to someone's outer shell, but something that comes from within. I was thinking, like, if you think about it, great leaders have that, something that comes from within. So if you think about it, Tao, Jesus Christ, Martin Luther King, like all of these people had this attraction that like people just couldn't resist, to the point where they were willing to risk their lives for their cause. Like if you look at somebody like Martin Luther King, he drew people in to the point where they would knowingly go into a dangerous situation and do it anyway because they believed in his virtue, they believed in what he was talking about. And Jesus and his apostles, a lot of his apostles died because they would not recant, or they would not deny Jesus. And so it's just, that part struck me. And then also, Shrikant, when you were reading your version, you were saying Tao in action or virtue in action. And I thought about, again, those leaders, they had something within them. Like, I think a lot of times we try to be something that we're not, or we try, like some people try to be like Martin Luther King and they fail at that instead of just trying to be who they are. And like, I think of that, like great leaders are who they are. They are not ashamed of who they are. It's just something within them and it attracts people to them. And when people try to imitate that, they fail miserably because it's not authentic. And I think having virtue is sometimes being authentic. And I think that's what people are really attracted to, is the authenticity of these leaders or people who are exhibiting the Tao, because they're just being who they are.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. Shane Murray, you're next. Sorry, I skipped you.
That's okay. I just was really drawn to what Phil had said. It resonated very deeply with me. As he spoke, it really kind of drilled in the notion that the very elusive nature of it kind of preserves a creative engagement with it, and a playful and creative engagement. And I just love that. It really opened it up for me. So thank you, Phil.
Wonderful. Phil, you're next.
We've been complaining about the West, and to a certain degree, pinning it on the Greeks. I do not want you to throw the Greeks under the bus, because the concept of virtue is manifested in Odysseus, who every Greek understand is the most virtuous man, right? Remember when Achilles got hit in the heel by the arrow and died? Of course, Ajax thought he deserved Achilles' armor because he was the second noblest of all the warriors, right? But he was the old order of power. And the armor was given to Odysseus, who was able to maneuver in the right way to find the right answers. And this was not so much proven by the Trojan horse, but by the Odyssey, when he was sailing through the twin pillars of what? Of dogma and nihilism. And even though the gods tried very hard to blow his ship hither and thither, he nonetheless, in his adventures, while experiencing things, he did return to Ithaca, which is what he wanted all along, right? So he represented virtue manifested in the world, because Ajax was not able to handle the dirt. You can't handle the dirt. Give it to Odysseus, right? And so therefore, he was the new manifestation of virtue, about what it is that you can manage the twin problems and sail home, despite the gods blowing him hither and thither. So which is his fate, but he is able to maneuver his ship and set his own destiny against the fate that gods throw upon him. So do not throw the Greeks under the bus, because it was later on that they hardened into dogma through actually Christianity in a way, as St. Augustine. But they were open to this understanding of manifesting in the world, and it takes that understanding. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Phil.
you for the Greeks.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll make one quick comment and then to Amon. You know, Lao Tzu and how he operates is closer to the oral tradition of the Greeks than the written tradition that developed afterwards. So for example, the Homeric stories, that is very much because it is mythos. It is not logos. It is mythos where the entirety of these beings are being portrayed through action, through emotion. The virtue is actually manifested in action, emotion, speech, all together in a story. When the logos becomes prominent, now I'm a big fan of logos. Okay, I'm a big fan of the West and what West has done with logos. But I think if you look at the previous, the oral tradition of Greeks, that is much more closer in its manifestation, its style, its expression to Lao Tzu than the written style. And it's not for nothing that Plato actually banned all the poets from his Republic because they were doing mythos, whereas he wanted to do logos. Next up is Amon.
Well, first I wanted to say, if it makes Phil happy, I'm totally content heaping all the blame on the Romans instead of the Greeks, if that appeases him. And second was, as to the Odyssey and Odysseus, I think that's kind of a funny selection because the end of the Odyssey is Odysseus returning home in disguise and his true character shining out from beneath that disguise, which you could not ask for a more poignant example of in action. But lastly, when you were just saying about how the Greeks feel closer to the East, there was an interesting interpretation of history that I was reading recently that marks the end of the classic era with the rise of Islam. And the reason it makes this as a choice is because prior to the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, what we think of as the Western world had roughly unfettered access to the Mediterranean region. And what you really had was a Mediterranean culture. Once the Caliphate was able to regulate trade within the Mediterranean region, you get this bifurcation that happens of Western culture versus an Eastern culture, because it was literally gatekeepers keeping those two regions of the world apart. And it would make sense that you would see much more similarity between the Greeks and the East than you would say late Romans and the East, or even later, Christendom and the East, because of the rise of Islam as that sort of stopgap between East and West.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you, Amon. Next up is Brian.
So I missed last week, so I apologize for that. I'd love to have had that. Before that, we had the session, and I was really puzzled at the end of it. What's the difference between and I'm still puzzled, but here's how I'm trying to puzzle it out. The difference between the concept of being in the West and the Tao in the East. And where I'm at right now is that the way the Western philosophers are writing about the being, at least as I'm understanding it and conceiving it, they're always thinking of the individual as going out and encountering being or the manifestations of being. So there's this kind of two worlds flowing towards each other, the individual and the outside world. And, you know, that's kind of the way I think and understand things. But I'm trying to understand now the Tao, and it's puzzled me the last, it's puzzling me more and more. I think the Tao spatially is not the individual encountering being, but the individual and the being are emanating from the same center and flowing out in the same direction. And that really, when that thought occurred to me, it really, I don't know how or why, but it really helped me understand this poem a lot better. And it answered a lot of the questions I had from the earlier sessions.
It's a great question, Brian. Jason.
Yeah, I think Brian asked a huge question about the being and the Tao. You know, it's at least three hours discussion on that. So I just want to share one fact to everybody: is Chinese language has no B. Okay, B-E. Okay, there's no B. So I believe without this one, B-E, the B verb, it make everything very different. Okay, so being, of course, people know Chinese, know, okay, the being you can translate as yes, can translate as is, okay, or 是 or something. So it just lack of something called being. And I think India has the concept of being or being, okay, but Chinese doesn't have this concept. So that makes a lot of things different.
So I really like that question, and we will pursue it in the future, because at some point I want to start looking at East and the West and start comparing it. But I think it's too early to do that, because Western philosophy has many different concepts of being, which are very different from each other. You know, Plato's concepts and Aristotle's concept, they're quite different. And so at some point I want to go where we can actually go ahead and start putting these together. But we'll keep that as an open question, and we'll keep coming back to it. All right, next, what we'll do is let's move on to number 22. If you'd like to read your translation, go ahead and type !! in chat. And we will go from there. So it's going to be number 22. We'll start with Judith. Judith, go ahead.
Okay, Stephen Mitchell, translation. If you want to become whole, let yourself be partial. If you want to become straight, let yourself be crooked. If you want to become full, let yourself be empty. If you want to be reborn, let yourself die. If you want to be given everything, give up everything. Oh, I'm sorry, give everything up. The master, by residing in the Tao, sets an example for all beings. Because he doesn't display himself, people can see his light. Because he has nothing to prove, people can trust his words. Because he doesn't know who he is, people recognize themselves in him. Because he has no goal in mind, everything he does succeeds. When the ancient masters said, if you want to be given everything, give everything up, they weren't using empty phrases. Only in being lived by the Tao can you be truly yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. This is going to be good. Next up is Evanique, followed by Mike. Evanique.
Yeah, I'm reading from the Divine Feminine Translation. The humble become whole, the crooked become straight, the empty become full, the weary become new, the poor become content, and the rich bewildered. Therefore the wise hold to the one and become shepherds for the world. Not claiming to be right, they stand out. Not showing off, they shine. Not boasting, they succeed. Not bragging, they endure. Since they do not compete, no one competes with them. The ancients said the humble become whole. How do these words be empty? Becoming whole relies on this.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Mike.
This is from Wayne Dyer. The flexible are preserved unbroken. The bent become straight. The empty are filled. The exhausted become renewed. The poor are enriched. The rich are confounded. Therefore, the sage embraces the one. Because he doesn't display himself, people can see his light. Because he has nothing to prove, people can trust his words. Because he doesn't know who he is, people recognize themselves in him. Because he has no goal in mind, everything he does succeeds. The old saying that the flexible are preserved unbroken is surely right. If you have truly attained wholeness, everything will flock to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Dave, Laura, David, and Charlie. Dave.
Yes, and just a comment first. My translation mentions bent over, and I think of someone with osteoporosis. But let me read now. Bent over, you'll be preserved whole. When twisted, you'll be upright. When hollowed out, you'll be full. When worn out, you'll be renewed. When you have little, you'll attain much. With much, you'll be confused. Therefore, the sage holds on to the one, and in this way becomes the shepherd of the world. He does not show himself off, therefore he becomes prominent. He does not put himself on display, therefore he brightly shines. He does not brag about himself, therefore he receives credit. He does not praise his own deeds, therefore he can long endure. It is only because he does not compete that therefore no one is able to compete with him. The so-called bent over, you'll be preserved whole of the ancients was an expression that was really close to it. Truly, wholeness will belong to him.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura, followed by Kevin. Laura.
Okay, this is from Lao Tzu, because the other one, Dyer's already been read. This is hope to behold, and to be straight, empty to be filled, wear down the renewed. Reduced to gain, excess confuses. Therefore the sage embraces the one and is an example to the world. He does not show off, therefore he shines. He does not justify himself, therefore is revered. He does not boast, therefore is honored. He does not praise himself, therefore he remains. Because he opposes no one in the world can oppose him. The ancients said, hope to be whole. Are these just empty words? Indeed, he shall remain whole.
Thank you, Laura.
Next
up is going to be Kevin. Kevin, if you could read the Chinese version.
Yes, thank you. For chapter 22, Chinese version, 曲则直，汪则直，曲则全，汪则直，洼则隐，敝则兴，少则得，多则惑。是以圣人报矣，为天下事。不自见，故明；不自是，故彰；不自伐，故有功；不自矜，故长。夫唯不争，故天下莫之与争。故之所谓曲则全者，其虚也哉？成全而归之。And
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be David, followed by Charlie. David.
Yes, again, Herman Old. If in humility you adapt yourself, you will remain complete. If bent, you will become straight again. If emptied, you will become full again. If worn, you will be renewed. He who has little may receive. He who has much may be embarrassed. Thus it is that the sage embraces the Tao and is an example for the world. He does not seek to shine, therefore he is illumined. He does not pride himself on being right, therefore his rightness speaks for itself. He does not sing his own praises, therefore he succeeds. He does not boast of what he achieves, therefore his work endures. He contends with none, therefore no one in the world contends with him. Thus, the ancient saying, if in humility you adapt yourself, you will remain complete, was no empty precept, for he alone attains completion who, yielding, returns home to the Tao.
Thank you, David. Next up is Charlie.
Okay, this one is kind of personal to me. It's because I've been a culture warrior for most of my life, and I'm ready to lay down my armor. Anyway, this is from Roger Ames and David Hall. Crimped, then whole, warped, then true, hollow, then full, worn, then new, modest, then satisfied, demanding, then bewildered. It is for this reason that the sages grasp oneness to be shepherds to the world. Those who are not self-promoting are distinguished. Those who do not show off shine. Those who do not brag have lots to show. Those who are not self-important are enduring. It is only because they do not contend that none are able to contend with them. Isn't that what the ancients call giving up the crimped for the sake of the whole? Getting close to what these words mean. This expression indeed says it all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Next up is Maritza.
Ashvika, I'm going to read again from Antonio Rivas. He titles this poem Aceptación y Contención. That's acceptance and contention. And I'll read, there's 3 paragraphs, so I'll read the paragraph and then translate. Acepta y serás completo. Inclínate y serás recto. Vacíate y quedarás lleno. Decae y te renovarás. Desea y conseguirás. Buscando la satisfacción, quedas confuso. Accept and you will be complete. Incline yourself and you will be straight. Empty yourself and you will remain filled. Decay and you will be rejuvenated. Desire and you will find. Looking for satisfaction, you will stay confused. El sabio acepta el mundo como el mundo acepta el Tao. No se muestra a sí mismo y así es visto claramente. No se justifica a sí mismo y por eso destaca. No se empeña y así realiza su obra. No se glorifica y por eso es excelso. No busca la lucha y por eso nadie lucha contra él. The wise man accepts the world like the world accepts the Tao. He does not show himself to himself, and in this way is seen clearly. He does not justify himself to himself, and for this, he is realized. He does not, he does not get stuck or insist upon a one thing, and like this realizes his masterwork. He does not glorify himself, and because of this, he excels. He does not look for the fight, and because of this, no one seeks to fight against him. Los santos decían, acepta y serás completo. Una vez completo, el mundo es tu hogar. The saints said, accept, and you will be complete. And once complete, the world is your home or your place.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marisa. Next up is going to be Margarita. If you could read in Bahasa, I would really appreciate that.
Yes. Chapter 22. Siapa yang mengakui dirinya serba kurang, ia akan menjadi sempurna. Siapa yang mengaku bengkok, akan dibuat lurus. Siapa yang mengaku masih kosong, akan dibuat penuh. Siapa yang mengaku telah rentah, akan diperbaharui. Siapa yang mengharapkan sedikit, akan mendapat sebaiknya yang mengharap terlalu banyak akan kalut. Dari itu, seorang budiman hanya mendukung satu hingga menjadi contoh bagi dunia. Tidak menonjolkan diri, maka ia mendapat muka terang. Tidak membenarkan diri, maka terkenalah kebajikannya. Tidak membanggakan jasanya, maka masyarakat akan mengakui pahalanya. Tidak menyombongkan diri sendiri, maka ia dapat langgeng kedudukannya. Siapa yang tidak suka berebut, maka orang sedunia tidak akan berebut padanya hingga ia terbebas dari persaingan. Dalam pepatah kuno dikatakan bahwa siapa yang mengaku dirinya serba kurang, justru ia akan sempurna. Ternyata ini bukan omong kosong, karena ia akan kembali dalam kesempurnaan yang sesungguhnya. So, yeah.
Margarita, there is a word sampurna.
Sempurna.
What does that mean? Complete?
Yes, perfection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, Bahasa Indonesia is a mix of languages,
Yes.
Malay, Sanskrit, Dutch, Javanese. So that's why you can hear probably some.
Yes, I can hear words in the middle. I can't hear most of the words, but suddenly like words.
Yeah,
stand out.
sempurna.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Jason.
No, yes, let me share the screen. And I think this one is very challenging. Okay, and Amang and I I have to do at least two versions. I'm not sure he's satisfied or not, but at least two. The second version, I am satisfied. So, but I'm not sure him. But okay, so there's a few challenges. But I think I view this one is very typical structure of Lao Tzu's teaching. Is if you notice the first sentence, Qu Ze Zi, my translation is yielding will remain whole. This one appeared twice, right? At the end, he said that's the saying from the antique. Okay, it's not a word, are not the vain words. So I believe the way of teaching is very typical. He used the old saying. Okay, everybody know these words. And then later on give you some example to further explain. And his example usually is about the nature world. And then he start to give you some lesson from this. They say, blah, blah, blah. And then for the conclusion, they tell you a lesson. Either you want to see as a political lesson or moral lesson, but basically they give you a lesson. Done. Okay, that's the typical structure. That's the first thing. And then second thing I highlighted in the red, okay, this one called 则. Okay, there's a 曲则全, 往则直, 洼则盈, 闭则盈. There's all 则 in the middle. Okay, this one is logical word. Okay, so I pay attention. I write down everybody's translation. So I categorize them like Judy's translation. Okay, you can say 曲则全, well, that's A 则 B, right? That's a logical sense. A something B, right? But ancient Chinese is very loose logical in the language. Okay, I believe Sanskrit probably have a more strict structure. That's why Chinese logical got heavily improved after Buddhism, introduced to China. Okay, but at that time, the logical sense is very loose. So I find out everybody's translation are different. For example, A something B, right? In Judy's translation, read as B, if B, then A, okay? And then in Evanic translation, they call it, and Mike translation called A become B. Okay, and in Dave's translation, they call it when A then B. So that means the temporal or sequential relation. And in Laura's translation, is A to be B. Okay. So, and then in David's translation, just reverse from what Judy's translation, they say it's a if A then B, right? And Charlie's said A then B, just totally ignore the condition. So I also see something like A but B or A and B. So that's very different way to explain it. So eventually I settled down with, because I believe Lao Tzu will teach, because he's going to give the example to this old saying. So he will use the nature. So he will say, look at the nature world. This is going on. Okay, that's I believe that's the way. That's why I will translate as A will become B naturally. So the translation will be a bent branch will become straight. A branch, if you bend it, it will straight by itself. Low ground will receive water. Okay, the withered leaf will grow new sprout. That's all nature situation. Then he start talk about a little bit in the human condition. He talk about possessing less will provide chance to gain. Okay. Possessing too much will cause one to be uncommitted. Okay, or you say confused, whatever. So basically, that's the explanation for the old saying. I translate as yielding will remain whole. You be soft, be flexible, and you will not be broken or be broken, or you can remain as a whole. Then he draw a conclusion. Therefore, the sage follow the one and become an exemplar to the world. Okay. And the most translation call it Dao. But if you look at the Chinese words, there's no doubt. Actually, it's one. This word is one. So if you go to chapter 42, the chapter 40 will have a further example. They say Dao, okay, will generate one. One will generate two. Two will generate three. Three will generate everything. So I believe here they say one, okay, follow the one. Basics is what Dao generate. So technically, it's not wrong to translate as Dao, but basics is more strict is what Dao generate. So that's right. Then let's go on. Basically, they have a 4 lesson. Okay. So I highlight. Okay, the blue one is good. Okay, basics logical means therefore. I believe everybody do the same thing. Basically, because something, therefore something. So that's. But I like highlight is this kind of called 4 vices. Okay, 4 things you don't do it. Okay, otherwise you will have the trouble. So I think in chapter 24 he will repeat exactly the same statement, but in different logical way again. So I think this one probably important, consider as 4 vices. So I consider 4 vices as all these words means self. So that means self-revealing, self-asserting, self-flaunting, self-revealing. Okay, so basics is all bad words. They were called bad consequence. So he asks us not revealing himself so he can be known. Talk about the sage. Not asserting himself so he can be appreciated. Not flaunting himself so he can be credited. Not revealing himself so he can endure. So that's the 4 lessons he's teaching, because he does not compete with the world. No one in the world could compete with him. So then he drew the conclusion. Okay, go back to the original saying. He said the saying from antique that yielding will remain whole are not just vain words. Indeed, the whole world will gather around him. So that means this one is really work. It's not just the cliche or something. So that's the work I work on this one. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. Amon, do you have any comments to add on the process of translating this one?
English is a very dumb language. I don't think we disagreed as much as I think Jason felt like we did, because this is a painful one to try and translate. The idiosyncrasies of the English language mean that the same sort of eloquence you can get from one line to the next sometimes is elusive, or you just can't encapsulate it the same way because of these stupid grammatical rules. I think the one thing that Jason was discussing that we were kind of disagreeing upon was his decision how to use the word z as a logical sort of therefore. And I don't know that I disagreed. I just did feel that there's a but, that it was a negative conjecture that was meant to say, but therefore. And I think that is a very, minute detail. We did go back and forth with this one a couple of times, but I think what Jason turned out is just absolutely masterful, and cannot fault him at all. All the credit goes to him. It was an excellent translation of a really challenging one.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Amon. Folks, now what did you get from number 22? Your thoughts on number 22. Go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Okay, we're going to start with Katie, followed by Evanique. Katie.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of wise advice for leadership too. Like oftentimes if people, like if they have too much of a, like if they're arrogant, sometimes it can like inspire people to like want to cut down the leader. Like they want control and then people want to kind of cut. So it's kind of saying it's going the other way, saying like by being like humble, then you inspire people to credit you. And I think that's really true. Like people sometimes inspire what they don't want with negative qualities.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Evanique, followed by Margarita. Evanique.
Okay, so my thoughts are a little all over the place with this one, as I heard different translations, but I think I'm going to try to condense it so that it makes sense. And I think the biggest thing is not trying to be something that you're not and being authentic, but I think it's deeper than that, in that you have to, there's a certain vulnerability that I hear in all these translations, in that you in order to just be open and be who you are without any pretense requires a certain amount of vulnerability. And it says, and just going back to the poem, just when it talks about the humble become whole, that first line, to be humble, you have to be a bit vulnerable and not think of yourself as better than anybody else, but it's also not thinking of yourself as less than anybody else. Like it's a confidence and it's a vulnerability all at the same time. And then it's kind of like you have to go through one phase to get to the next phase. Like you have to go through poor to be content. You have to, and it's a theme in that first paragraph. It says the crooked become straight, the empty become full, the weary become new. You have to like almost be at a low point in order to get to that point. And the vulnerability of going through that and the humility that brings, I think that is a theme. And I think that's like, it takes a strength to go through this whole poem and to be the person in this poem. But when you do that, you get to a better place. You get to the place where you need to be in life, but you have to go through these things. Like we all have that journey that we have to go through. And I think of water, and like it has to go through the rocks. It has to go through all the rough spots in order to get to where you need to. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Evanique. Next up is going to be Margarita, Mike, and Maritza. Margarita.
Yes, thank you. Reading this passage reminds me to Beatitudes, Jesus preached in the hill. It's but in Christian tradition, it's more about reassurance, consolation. But actually, at that time, it's also deconstruction, because previously people believed they will go to heaven because they good deed. However, Jesus said no, it's because of the mercy. So perhaps this also triggers us to deconstruct our own idea about that we need to feel empowered. We need to have some things. We are constructed, molded by our society to achieve things. But actually we are lacking. So this, just like Evanik said, by reading this passage, we need to go to this journey, acknowledging with humility that we have nothing. And it's not easy. I think that encouraged us to do so because by acknowledging that we are not knowing, Tao will perfect the flaws. However, this leads to one question I have, Srikan. So, because in Christian tradition, this deconstruction requires different way of learning. So, do you think the way we learn Tao will be different from the way we perceive knowledge from this Western tradition, analyzing, synthesizing, dissect things into components? Whether because being meek and try to question our journey, try to be empty, perhaps we will need some kind of different learning. Thanks.
Wonderful, beautiful question. Jason, would you like to answer that in terms of how do you learn Tao in the Taoist tradition versus how do you pursue knowledge in the Western tradition? What's the difference?
Yeah, great question from Margarita. I think that's very different from the Western way of learning. Okay, that's first thing, and even not consider orthodox way in the Chinese way, right? Because the Confucius way is not this way. So basics, I think later on, if you pay attention, that not only Wu Wei, okay, that means no action. The action is no action. It's study without study. Okay, speaking without speaking. Something like this. There's a lot of words, on that. So it's hard, but is that practical? I'm not sure, But a lot of things you just swallow it and then just try to make sense of it. So that would be my own experience. Okay, so if you compare to Western philosopher, I would say if you read Heraclitus, they have the same flavor. And about the teaching, Nietzsche, okay, has a lot of similarity here. He talk about God is dead, but not really means that God is dead. He talk about hate your neighbor. Okay, it's not really hate your neighbor. It's just give you different idea. So it's difficult to explain. I faced the same problem when I in the Nietzsche's Meetup because I think that's the same flavor. That's the only thing I have to say. And another thing I'd like to mention, I forget mention is this point probably is the source of one famous Chinese saying. If you're familiar with the Chinese culture, Chinese constantly have the 4 words saying, kind of like a lesson. Okay, so some common saying is like 委曲求全. Okay, that means that's from this first sentence. Okay, because they say you bend it, you yield. That's the way you keep us whole. Okay, so that's the famous saying, in the Chinese today coming from. But in today's sense, a little bit more negative than the Taoism teaching. Taoism teaching more on the positive side, but after a long time, probably being influenced by Confucius teaching, become a little bit negative. That means you suffer yourself to survive, or become like you suffer yourself, you lose your dignity to pursue more money, okay, more fame, and that become a negative teaching, not a positive teaching. So that's the some historical account I just like to share with everybody. Yeah, thank you.
So Margarita, I mean that is a question that I also struggle with a lot, because what I'm trying to do, though I do not understand the East, and I do not understand the West, I'm trying to see how they come together. Okay, because it's like again, I'm saying all of this with not really knowing the East that well, not really knowing the West that well. So these are the impressions that I have. One way to look at it is the oral tradition and the written tradition. The Lao Tzu is very close to the oral tradition. Whereas most of the West that we think of, especially the modern West after printing, people like Descartes onwards, are very much heavily abstract. And the print, you just take in the words and you are kind of manipulating the words. Whereas even in the earlier traditions of whether it is the Bible with all its stories or the Homeric myths, all of that is kind of fully embodied. So if you look at what Lao Tzu is saying, is that he's saying, just go back to nature, just pay attention to what nature is and what you are. So it is kind of, emphasis is on metaphysics, whereas increasingly, especially the modern times, the emphasis is on epistemology. It is focused on words and it is about manipulating the words. And often they lose contact. So for example, Nietzsche in that sense is a rebellion against that abstraction of saying, look, the abstract are, you're holding on to these forms which are not useful anymore. Let's go back to the root. Let's go back to nature. Let's go back to kind of true feeling, something like that. So there is, and all of these things are enormously complicated because there are all these layers. So Heraclitus, I agree with Jason, is very much in the, is very much closer to Lao Tzu. So is the older oral traditions. So it is kind of logos versus mythos as best as I can understand it. Lao Tzu is extremely concerned about logos. He said, don't fall for logos, don't fall for logos. That's what he keeps saying. That names are only manifestations, things are only manifestations. Go back to that. Now, I'm not criticizing the West, okay? West is superb at names. The entire scientific tradition is about how do you make names and naming self-reflective, self-checking, testing as a process. So it's enormously developed. Logos is enormously developed in the West. But at the same time, a lot of Western philosophy gets too much focused on the abstractions and gets away from connection with reality, with nature. So that's what I would say. But great question. And what we'll do is that we will actually have many, many opportunities of looking at East and the West as we go along. Next.
If I may add this a little bit.
Please.
Yeah, this is also more my self-personal reflection, because every time I read more this Tao, and when I try to analyze it, I feel more in conflict, because the Tao say, lose your logos. I mean, don't think. I wonder whether dissecting all these texts are making me comes to Tao or making me away from Tao. That's just a personal reflection, but thank you, Srikant.
Thank you, Margarita. Next up is going to be Mike, Maritza, Dave, and Judith. Mike.
Yeah, there were two lines from the Wayne Dyer translation that really struck me. One is, because he has nothing to prove, people can trust his words. And then later he says, because he has no goal in mind, everything he does succeeds. And I find those two sentences manifesting themselves here at 52 Living Ideas, because what I notice and what I feel is that there isn't somebody here that's trying to prove something. The words are flowing freely. And also because there's no goal in mind, it reminds me of when I was in college, when there was clearly a goal in mind, not just to graduate, but to get good grades along the way. And what I'm finding here with these interactions is that I'm listening to language. I'm hearing about so many things that I just never understood before. And because I'm not striving, I'm not pushing to learn and to memorize and to regurgitate, I find that it's a very, very different way of learning that I've really never experienced before. It just feels like it's coming in without any pressure. And I also agree with Margarita. I similarly feel sometimes that I don't want to study the Tao. I just want to experience it. So that's also a different, I mean, I agree with her. I felt that very often. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate that. Next up is Maritza.
Shrikant, I view this poem as being very much a poem on yielding. Like it's, so the Spanish translation doesn't actually use the word yield at all, but it uses accept. And, you know, it caused me to ponder and wonder, what exactly are we accepting? What is meant? And what it actually made me think, what helped me actually was reading some of the English translations, because some of them actually do use the word yield. Actually, your favorite translation uses it was struck me. I'm stealing a phrase from your favorite translation. She starts and she ends with saying, be broken to be whole. And that one was super impactful to me on an emotional level. But there's a part of me that rejects that manner of stating it, like be broken and be whole. I was like, I don't want to be broken. But I was able to make my peace with it by thinking of this word yield. And what it made me think of was, so I have a weird thing from my childhood that I have, it's like ingrained in me, and I try to resist it, but I do find myself that it bothers me when I don't do it. And it's the walking on the outside, and when you're on the sidewalk versus the inside of a street. You know, in general, when I'm with family or anyone in my culture, it goes without saying, the male will walk on the outside. And when you're with other cultures, they don't even think about it. But you don't, but I'm American, I'm Americanized. I don't want to make a deal of it. I want to be normal. But I find myself, I move myself, but I tend to do it in a manner that anyone who's ever walked with me probably has never noticed that I'm moving myself inside. I had a conversation with a friend years ago about it. And once he realized it, he had the thought, well, I'm going to be a better American male and I'm going to move myself to the outside. But we had already had several years behind us of me quietly shifting myself. Well, we started to kind of run into each other when we were walking. I was like, what's happening? And he said, I just realized what the problem is. He goes, and he tried to do it. He said with me, then it was working, but he tried to do it with an American female. She got very upset. And he says, the thing is with you yield slightly. It's not a lot, but you'll slow down or something. If you think I'm going to move, you'll slow down or you'll go behind me. And he was like, it's very seamless, but it's like, it's a very small nonverbal yielding. And you do it without any penalty to yourself or your person. And so that came to mind to me for this poem, because it made me think that we sometimes get this mistaken impression that in yielding to something around us or within us, we somehow make ourselves lesser, when that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. Sometimes we need to yield in order to get that thing which we really desire. And when we're actively trying to get that thing that we desire, we might misstep and not make it. So it's kind of it's that whole, the surest way to miss something is by aiming at it directly. I'm going through, flow, we say if you aim for happiness, that's the best way to miss it. Aim instead for the meaningful path and you'll have this byproduct. And that's what I'm hearing in this poem, this concept that it's you have to yield. And it's like that whole let go, and it may tumble into place. I think I'm still sorting out within myself how much I agree with that, because there's a little bit of an irritant there, but I do hear this admonition that when trying to ensure that I'm walking the meaningful path, I am making certain that along that path, I will be required to yield. And that's my take on it.
Wonderful. I like the way you put it. So I'm going to read my favorite translation and then make just a very short comment here. Be broken to be whole. Twist to be straight. Be empty to be full. Wear out to be renewed. Have little and gain much. Have much and get confused. So wise souls hold to the one and test all things against it. Not showing themselves, they shine forth. Not justifying themselves, they're self-evident. Not praising themselves, they're accomplished. Not competing, they have in all the world no competitor. What they used to say in the olden days, be broken to be whole, was that mistaken? Truly, to be whole is to return. The way I see this is that it is kind of accepting rhythmic changes in nature. So there's a way in which nature flows, and if you try to push against how the nature is flowing, that doesn't work. You have to realize that there are certain patterns and they keep coming back. And you kind of have to trust the patterns of nature and work along those lines. So that's how I see it. Next up is Dave, Judith, and Phil. Dave.
Shrikant, I wanted to thank Jason for showing us the Chinese text and especially highlighting the words that repeat from line to line. And each, of course, in the Chinese characters, there's just 3 or 4 characters, and it looks like a couple of them repeat on 3 or 4 lines. And unfortunately, we have to deal with a translation that's a sentence or a phrase. And it's appearing to me that the Tao is much more poetic than I can appreciate, but just those one character changing and the other 2 staying the same for 3 or 4 lines. I'm too late for me to learn Chinese, but I'm just starting to appreciate the character of what we're getting into. I think the translators try to get that character, because it has the contradictions, the hollow and full, and this, that, and the other. But it looks like the Chinese is very beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is going to be Judith, iPhone 1225, and then Phil. Judith.
Yeah, so I like what Maritza said. I mean, basically she expressed, it resonated with me in the same way. I did not have the word yield. I was thinking more along the line of release and relinquish. But I mean, in my translation, the very last 2 lines are, only in being lived by the Tao can you be truly yourself. So it's sort of like you're being lived by it. So you have to really allow it to work through you rather than you working on it. And I wanted to address that East-West conversation that was going on, because it's interesting to me always, though, that this is an Eastern idea, thought being presented in each chapter, obviously. But they're addressing East-West, if you want to call it that, issues, because they're saying, well, if you want to be whole, if you want to be straight, if you want to be full, like the very Western thing of creating, making, doing, understanding, defining, deciding, controlling, proving, all those things that maybe we associate with West or labeling or making or creating. It's like it's more like a human universal sort of thing, that this is what we're doing all day long, every day. It's what we do. We present ourselves, we acquire things, create things. So it's almost just like a reminder to me that is like saying, step back for a moment. Sometimes you will find what you need by letting go of that control and letting it be. And many times in my own life, I've found that if I do, especially when I, sometimes just let it go and let it happen in somebody else's way or in some other, or the way things will just fall into play. You can't do it all the time, obviously. That, I mean, that wouldn't be the right way to go about it, but sometimes that is the best way. So how do you know when is another question, but I think that it's just letting us know that we lean, all of us, East and West, probably more toward making things the way we want and we envision. And sometimes the Tao has a wiser direction if we let it flow through us.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Elena, formerly known as iPhone 1225. Go ahead.
Yes, representing Apple. All right, thank you. So I just found one of the translations, and I'm not going to read everything, but just quote the last two sentences. From the days of the old till now, its named, its manifested forms have never ceased, by which we may view the Father of all things. How do I know the shape of the Father of all things? Through these named, manifested forms. So to me, it's like it's a very different translation from what I've heard, and it's like the going to Bible is like there was a word. So we, in order to be in this reality, we have to have a tool, we have to have a way, and it's again we have to conceptualize things. And it's this poem specifically says like this, you conceptualize, so there is a way to go back through non-conceptualizing, but you need to know the way the nature works. That's like, to me, it's very profound. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Next up is Phil.
I could only make sense of this through my artistic experience. And since I put my interpretation in terms of creativity, that's not necessarily a problem. Part of it is because I actually either totally do not understand Jason's translation or disagree with it, one way or the other. So that's part of the problem, that I couldn't get a hold of it. I think what he's saying is the contrast, not between nature, but between the Tao, which is related to nature, and civilization. Civilization, through concepts, builds a structure that necessarily hardens into a dogma. So in order to get away from it, you have to get away from that dogmatic manifestation of things and into interiority that is still connected to nature or to the Tao by the De. However, I think the main word here is surrender. Not only just giving way, but surrender to the other in the sense. So you are surrendering to the Tao in order to escape this dogmatic structure that's exterior by going interior. However, I think he's also saying that even when you're on the path, which is the De, to the Tao, you also have to be cautious that you surrender to the unfolding, because quite often when the unfolding happens, we said, aha, I'm beginning to get it. I understand what's going on. You begin to possess the thing that's unfolding, but you must also surrender yourself to that possession of the thing that's unfolding, because the other, which is the second word that I want to use, that's important, is not just the manifestation or the causal relationship, which Jason seemed to relate to, even though it's a softer causation. But you have to surrender to the contrast of what I call the difference within the manifestation itself, that you do not own that difference, because the difference keep unfolding as you go. And you have to say, oh, I'm going straight, maybe it should be crooked. It completely a different way. The contrast, the difference that allows you to continue on the path that it should be on, rather than say, oh, just, once you turn the corner, just go straight, you're going to get to the destiny. That's not what it is. So you have to not only surrender to the Tao by abandoning the culture to a certain degree, the forgetfulness, but you also have to surrender yourself unto the unfolding, so that you do not have ownership to it, because it will maneuver the way you say, oh, now it's changing. Now I have to improvise and do whatever and follow it. And so therefore the surrender to the difference is a very important aspect of it, rather than, in a sense, surrender to the causation, because it's not the causation, it's the difference. That's why the crooked becomes the straight, and all that contrast is important. So that's the way I interpret it. The creative process must also surrender unto the creative process itself, not to your ownership of it.
Wonderful, beautifully put, beautifully put. Excellent. So I want to raise one last question here, and that is between East and the West. We've been reading, we are about quarter of the way through this book, and we've got a flavor of the East. How does this view compare with the West? What are the virtues of this way of thinking? What are the virtues of the West? What are the limitations of this way of thinking? What are the limitations of the West? Now here in East, I'm just looking at Dao De Jing. Okay, East is very large, just like West is very large. West is we are more familiar with, East we are not that familiar with. So we're just looking at Dao De Jing and putting it against Western tradition of thinking, of being, of organizing, and any observations you have at this level. So let's try to keep it brief so everybody gets to have their say. We started by talking about names. I think Margarita had the question about names. There is a dramatic difference between Dao De Jing and the Western tradition on how it deals with names. The West is very, very sophisticated. It has its limits, but it's very sophisticated. And so, but I want to hear everybody's take, because that's the thing that I'm most interested in, of saying, how do all these traditions interact with one another? What can you learn from one tradition when you're rooted in another tradition? What do we pay attention to, and what can we pick up? So let's try to keep the comments brief so we can have many people comment at a very high level on what you're seeing as Dao De Jing as compared to the Western tradition as you understand it. It's going to be Judith, followed by Charlie.
Offhand, my first observation or thought is that the West has an emphasis on the individual, and quite the opposite. In the East, it seems like there's more of an emphasis on what is universal.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Charlie, followed by Mike. Charlie.
Very brief, okay? West, naming, objects, properties. East, ineffable, holism, and gestalt. That's it.
Beautiful, beautifully put, beautifully put. I think you're right, and I think you've captured something really fundamental. Next up is Mike, followed by Dave. Mike.
I think we can do both or combine both ourselves. For example, through this meetup, taking notes, listening to the different languages and researching what you don't know. And then when you're done, read the notes, be reflective, and then literally meditate, and then see where that takes you. Do both.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Dave, Evanique, Shane Murray, and Phil. Dave, what difference do you see between East and West? And what are the virtues of each and limitations of each?
Yeah, I will extend a little bit on Judas, but comparing the Bible with the Tao is very general. Now you talk about the sage, rather than that, more or less talking about the common person. Where in the Bible, we're identifying people and telling stories, but I think as practically, if we interpret the Bible and we go to church, this, that, and the other, we say, okay, well, Jonah was swallowed by the whale. What that applies to me in my life, I apply that story, even though it's about someone else. So I think we get to the same place, but yeah, I would say the format is different. Thank you very much. It's been a great study.
Next, thank you. Next up is Evanique, Shane Murray, Kevin, and Phil. Evanique.
Yeah, I think when I think of the West, I think of ownership. And when I think of the East, I think of more sharing in terms of land. And I think the limitations, I don't know if I wouldn't call them even limitations. I just think they're differences. And I think I agree with Mike, if you can combine them both, I think you have like a holistic approach.
Thank you, Evanique. Shane Murray.
The thing that comes to mind for me, and especially as it pertains to the Tao and other philosophies like the Christian philosophy, is that the Tao is immediately accessible even as a novice, whereas I feel like with the typical dogma of the church, you often feel like an outsider, and so you don't want to even participate if that's something you immediately comprehend.
Thank you. Thank you, Shane Murray. Next up is Kevin.
Yeah, every chapter I like, a couple of words. It's interesting because you see each word like this is, I seen the link. It's from 2,000 years ago. It's used to be a different shape. Basically, if you understand original meaning, it's not straight. Band is closed. And Jason used the yield, and then then you surrender in a negative way, you can, right? And I like the Evanique about sharing. That's the first one. Chu ban, not a ban, will be straight, right? So it's here's about a shared. You look at this chapter, you could be from individual or community level, understand difference. If from individual, I still can see that I can apply to yourself. Be yourself. Don't compare with others. And if from a community, let's see, you can see the collective effort still have something. Later other compete, you can behind until they cannot do, you do it. The society get better. You don't need everybody want to gold medal. It's going to, broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Elena. Elena, what do you think? What do you see as the difference between East and West? What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of each?
To me, it's just the major difference lies in education. That's where we all began, one way or another. We all went to school, and Western model of education is based on industrial age. So it's going to class, sit quietly, have a very structured way, and learn what you hear, repeat, memorize. And it's very, very structured. That's where we all, in the West, that's how we were educated. Versus East, it's very different concept. It's more, less structured. And again, I have not been educated there. I just seen in India, in Rajasthan, how kids learn in schools in different level. And that was very impressive. It's just anti-West. It's going towards the Western type of model. But anyone who could contribute to that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. India education is far more structured than the West, but that's a separate story. Next up is Phil, followed. So it's going to be Phil, but I want to ask Maritza and Brian what they think about East and the West. I'm very curious. Phil.
It seems to me the difference is that the West is more about answers, The East is more about questions.
Very good.
But sometimes the East could be frustrating because it could be an endless unfolding of questions. And sometimes you want answers because answers give you a sense of control and power, where questions could only give you a sense of participation with the questions. But the frustration with answers is that if you want to participate, you have to engage in deconstructing the answers to create new questions.
Thank you. Next up is Brian, followed by Maritza. Brian.
Well, I'm still exploring this idea that in the West, there are two centers of energy or force that encounter each other. All the words that I've heard here in 52 Living Ideas, through Jordan Peterson and Nietzsche and the rest, they all talk about encounter of the individual with the unknown. It's conflict, these kinds of words. And then with the Tao, just trying, again, what struck me today and listening to everybody is that there's a single center where both nature and individuals arise out of this single center. So that puts an emphasis more on harmony, and some of these other aspects or virtues of the Eastern philosophy that are, that are widely recognized. So I'm just following this thought. The other thought I have is that I think in the West, not just the individual and the nature are separate, in some ways opposed, but also understanding nature. You alluded to it earlier, there's the nominalist and the materialist idea. And once we've created that division, it's posed a dilemma ever since in the West.
Thank you, Brian. Maritza, what do you think?
So Shrikant, I feel it's a weird thing for me. The more I learn a little tiny bit about the East, I find myself questioning, where does my culture fit? We're the West, naturally. We're solidly in the West, but more of our teachings or beliefs seem to fall a little bit better with some of those from the East. And it does leave me kind of confused a little bit from, where do we stand in, but what it also does for me is that it makes me see that East versus West is maybe the wrong question. Because isn't it possible that some of the teachings or beliefs of the East reside in the West still, just maybe more subtle or maybe forgotten or hidden? And in some cultures in the West, it's a little less hidden, a little bit more pronounced. And so I'm learning as I journey with the rest of you here that, just as with all things, nothing is either or, there's a little bit more and in there. And for me specifically, I feel like the words that are given by the West for some of those things that I have heard in my culture for so long, they tend to obfuscate, sorry, it doesn't translate to English, submerge a little bit the actual meaning behind what I have learned or what I carry, because it's very weird when you and you probably know this far more than she can't, but it's a tight walk to honor your culture, but be truly immersed as an American, it's a very, it's a tight, but I feel that looking at some of the philosophies of the Eastern traditions shows that one can have both. Like it's not necessarily a either or. And that's just, I don't know. Maybe I'll get a better grip for how to express it as time goes on. Thank you, Shrikant.
Oh, this is wonderful. I mean, I see all of us are learning, and this is a very deep issue. And all these kind of, divisions, East and West, are kind of manifestations, are these names and labels that we're using to try to get at some kind of differences that we see. So just on the West, I want to point out 3 different axes. One that you're pointing about, kind of the, you can look at like the Southern European culture versus the Northern European culture. And it actually varies on this same, so it is a Southern European culture is closer to the Eastern culture, as you're saying, that, Spanish, Italian, it's far more closer to that way of thinking and way of expressing all of that, as compared to English or German. Okay, so that's one thing. So within Europe, things differ. The second is the issue of technology, oral versus print. You can see while people are actually dealing with one another, even in England or in Germany, within a family, they are going to actually feel the Tao, and they are going to act with the Tao far more when they are actually doing stuff in business or trying to read books. So there is a difference between the, what happens when you're using different technologies in interacting and operating. Third is time. So for example, Brian Kemple, there was a wonderful, wonderful conversation I had with Brian Kemple on Sunday. And he was pointing out that the medieval sensibility is very different from the modern sensibility. So the medieval sensibility is like people like Aquinas is far more, it's so different that people don't actually get it. So for example, Descartes onwards, things, like Descartes said, I have this intuition. There is something I have produced in my head. And then you're kind of looking to the world to say, okay, now how do I make the world relate to that? So it's kind of a very odd way of starting. So you have produced some words, and now you're trying to struggle to get related to nature. And then there is all kinds of problems about facts and values and this and that, all of it. When you go back to people like Aristotle or Aquinas, they think in terms of this flow that is going on between life and mind, or the cogitative sense of Aquinas as, or, kind of control mechanism of Aristotle for life, as kind of naturally flowing from one to the other. So there isn't this separation of creating something artificial and then trying to build. So there is, so this view of kind of East versus West has changed within West. It was like, for example, medieval, like Aquinas or Aristotle are far more closer, or Heraclitus are far more closer to the East than, or to the Tao than, people like Descartes or Kant, where there is a very, very sharp distinction. So there is, difference in those, but all of these are kind of pointing to some fundamental things about human beings. And the thing I really love about studying Dao De Jing is that it allows us to reflect on it in a fairly radical way, because it is so unfamiliar to us. The language, the way of presentation, use of poetry and metaphors, as opposed to declarative sentences, all of that is so different that we notice things better because of the difference. And then we can use the same differences that we make, or similarities and differences, to see similarities and differences within the West. So, so thank you, Maritza. That was great. Next up is Katie, followed by Kevin. Katie.
I think there's also a tendency to make people examples more in the Bible, like good examples and bad examples, and also to moralize a little bit more. I think also nature in the Bible is a little bit more dynamic. Like you see like floods, and you see like, even though you're more connected to nature in the Tao, nature is kind of more, seems more peaceful in Tao Te Ching versus like in the Bible. You can see calamity, and so that was my point.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Kevin, what do you think about East and the West?
Yeah. Can I follow the Phil and Marisa comment?
Please.
Yeah, Marisa, I firstly Phil got a good observation about the question and answer. Let's see, try understand West East. Yes, here's it is from Western side. We give answer, give a logo. When we let's see difference between the Taoist side, when you name the beauty, the ugly going to arise. If you don't name it, we don't consider. If we see good, a bad going to come. So that will give us some warning or attention about this logo or practice. When we make friend, possible we didn't consider a friend, we could consider enemy. So that's the danger, I would say. From some angle, this could be the equal as human being or break down we are atom, right? So that's one angle from Marisa. I agree with her. She said it's not either or yes or no. It's something between. Then here the yin and yang. It's yin. If you see a logo, it's clear. The black side have a little bit of white dot. The white side have a black dot. That means even we say we good. Good itself should have something. It's need a little bit of bad inside. Normally, like we put a logo product, sell something, I only mention perfect thing, not mention something missing or need approve. But in each side, let's see not each side, let's see another side, we cannot tell you the whole story. That's my product, that's something need approve. I'm going to pause there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Now, Charlie, you had the pithiest capturing of this. Could you please repeat that and say something more about that? That was just wonderful.
Well, it's funny because I was just trying to remember what I said. I remember that I said about the West was about objects, properties, and I forgot what the third one was. But about the East, I said it was ineffability, holism, and gestalt. Mm-hmm. And I see the way I see it is captured a lot by the work of Ian McGilchrist, where he looks at the left brain and the right brain. And I think that's a very important piece of physical evidence that the difference is captured actually in physical reality. And so the right brain tends to look at things that way in terms of wholes, but the left brain wants to take things apart and analyze and as McGilchrist points out, there's a very strong tendency to reify, to say this is it. I figured it all out. I got the theory that explains everything. And for me, the way I look at it, I like to do that. That little intellectual stuff. Okay. But I try to not take it seriously, okay? In other words, if I see an idea, I say, well, that looks like a fun idea, and then I'll play with it or something like that. Kind of like a little kid playing with the Legos or blocks or something like that. But, or building a sandcastle on the beach, and the waves come in and wash it away. It's a fun activity, as long as you don't let the, as Ian McGilchrist puts it, as long as you don't let the emissary become the master.
Wonderful.
That's the problem.
Wonderful. Now, very well put. I mean, it actually captures I think the right brain, left brain captures a lot. You can think of it in terms of kind of chaos and order, or kind of potential and order. It's like the right brain is really good at noticing potential, or kind of being aware of the uncharted territory, things that are at the periphery of awareness. Whereas the left brain is about focusing on things. Another way of looking at it is kind of exploration versus application. So you're kind of exploring, and then you are applying the knowledge that you have already learned. And you're trying to kind of create the order, but the order is being created in the midst of this potential chaos, which is much larger. And so and it needs to be continuously refreshed. So there is this, this cycling going on between the right brain and left brain, between order and chaos, where you're continuously reordering things. Otherwise, the order dies. As soon as you stop doing that, the order starts to die. So ordering is critical in order to kind of build things up of any scale. But you need to refresh. I mean, to kind of bring it to a completely different context, the founding fathers were very much aware of this problem. And they actually had a solution to it. So it's a question of how do you design a structure so that it is responsive? It provides enough continuity and order, but at the same time is responsive at all levels, across times, across geography, to each other. So that's the whole idea of kind of the Constitution, and how do you build a system which both has order, so that there is a stability and people can work together effectively. At the same time, there is enough room for disagreement and a mechanism to keep changing the structure. So that's kind of the problem. But that's kind of bringing together both of these. So that's kind of a solution at kind of political science level of the same kind of issues. But Judith, you had something.
Oh yeah, just quickly. It's like the East is more comfortable with the unknown and just comfortable with there is unknown, and the West is very uncomfortable with that and needs to make it known. That's all I would add.
Yeah, one of the best formulations I've seen is from my friend Yasuhiko, because that's the one thing that we talk a lot about. He puts it in a visual terms. He says the way in which West grows is through this sphere. Imagine like a sphere. So it has all these concepts and all these things, and they keep on, as the sphere keeps on growing, it actually, as it grows, the amount of unknowns around it keep growing, and it keeps on responding to that and growing as a structure, structured way. It keeps on growing. The way in which East goes is that it kind of goes from center to out. It's just trying to take this whole pattern of movement in, not really building the structure much, but just being aware of your core and all of nature and all of the possibilities in which you can move. So it's like, it's the gestalt of the whole that the East is fascinated with, whereas the West is also doing exploring, but in a very different way. So, but my entire approach to it is that I'm not a Taoist. I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to take in all the traditions, and you kind of, and same approach that Yasuhiko is using of saying, we have to learn from everything. We can't, in order to appreciate, you have to appreciate the past, but you can't throw away things that have been achieved afterwards in order to do that. So, but that means that you have to kind of make them talk to each other in your own mind, have a conversation, a real conversation, so that you can bring all the positive things from the past, from other cultures, without losing the greatness and just enhancing what we have done. All right, folks, amazing meetup. Charlie, if you could stick around for a couple of minutes, I want to talk to you about meetups. Can you do that? You have a couple of minutes?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.